am very excited to introduce Sidura Ludwig. Sidura grew up in Manitoba, Canada. She now lives, Sidura, is it suburban Toronto?
Yeah, that's probably the best way to describe it, suburban Toronto.
Okay, that's the American way of describing suburban Toronto with her husband and her children. She majored in English and creative writing at York University in Toronto. She got a master's in journalism at Carleton University in Ottawa. And she is currently working on her MFA in writing for children and young adults from the Vermont College of Fine Arts, which is how I got to know Sidura about a year ago, because I started at Vermont the same time she did. We did not know that we shared Judaism for a little while. After we started, we shared the love of writing, but then Sidura started having some Shabbat celebrations for the Jewish students on campus, and I got invited, and I was just delighted to be a part of that. It was really a very generous and lovely thing for her to do. In her professional life, she has numerous nonfiction articles in a wide variety of Canadian newspapers and the CBC. She has many works of short fiction in literary journals and magazines. Sidura got her start writing by winning a contest and scholarship competition offered by the Canadian Authors Association Short Fiction Contest when she was only 18 years old. She has taught creative writing to children since that time in Winnipeg, Toronto, Birmingham, UK, and Boston, Massachusetts. She strives to never stop learning, which is why she's still in school. And that also serves writers very well, because if you keep curiosity, then you can always find something new to write about.
What are you looking for?
Sidura is on the faculty of the Sarah Selecki, did I say that right?
Selecki.
Writing School, teaching the story course. In her life outside of writing, Sidura works for not-for-profit organizations as a communication specialist. Her first novel was published in 2007-8, depending where it was released. Holding My Breath was shortlisted for the Carol Shields Winnipeg Book Award and was a finalist in the CBC Cross Canada Bookshelf. The story collection that we're reading today for today's book meeting is You Are Not What I Expected. This is a collection of short stories tied together by the theme that is both timely, given today's explosive headlines, of the consequences of society's expectations of any single group of people, and also timeless because we're always in a cycle of newness. The title hints both of the perceptions that people have coming to a new place and also how people might see you as a new resident. And so I would like to welcome Sidura and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Julie. So first of all, I want to thank you all for having me this afternoon. You are my second book talk that I'm giving on this book, but Justin was the first one to reach out to me to book something, and I'm just thrilled to be able to speak with you. I know this was always intended to be virtual. I just have to say I wish I could come and speak in person. I wish with all my book talks that I could come and speak in person. I miss connecting in person with readers. And I haven't even been into a bookstore yet to see this book on the shelf. And I know like things are starting to open up here. I think I probably could go into a bookstore now, but I realized the other day when my cousin told me that she had seen it on a bookshelf somewhere that, oh, thank you. Yeah, I have my bookshelf that it's on, but I haven't, but I remember with my first book, when the first time I walked into a bookstore and I saw it sitting on the shelf, alphabetized where it was supposed to be, or sitting on a table, it was picked as, like, at that point, a hot new release or something, and there's a real thrill that comes with that. And so look, there are a lot of things that that obviously much bigger issues that people are dealing with and suffering with right now, but that's some of the changes that just some of the things, some of the changes that that I'm noticing with putting out a book at this time. So I wanted to chat with you, give you a little bit of, well, Julie gave you quite a background to me, so I don't know if I'm going to have to go into quite as much detail, but talk a little bit about my writing life and how this particular book came to be. And then there are really 3 big lessons that I learned as a writer in writing this book, and I thought I would share those with you. And then just give me a show of hands, how many of you have read the book? And this is not a test. I just want to know. So just a couple. Okay. So if all right. Thank you. Thanks, Marilyn. If so, I could also read a short section of it, and maybe what I'll do is, so I'll talk first, read a short section, and then I really want to make sure that I leave enough time for questions so that I can answer that and we can have a bit of a conversation. So like Julie said, I grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Do people know where Winnipeg is? Yeah, okay. Hi, Judy. So those of you that maybe aren't familiar, Manitoba is the province that is just north of North Dakota. So Winnipeg is about a 2-hour drive north of Grand Forks. And that's, to give you a bit of an idea about what it was like to grow up in Winnipeg. Winnipeg itself is, it's a city now, it runs about 600,000 people. And the Jewish community around the time when I was there was probably about 14,000 Jews. And I come from my great-grandparents actually settled in Winnipeg from Russia. So my grandparents were born in Canada. My parents were born in Winnipeg. I was born in Winnipeg. I'm sort of like a long line of Winnipeggers. It's a pretty isolated city to live in, but it's a big city. And, so if you wanted to, when I describe what it's like growing up there, in terms of the next biggest cities, Minneapolis is about an 8-hour drive away from Winnipeg. Toronto is a 33-hour drive away from Winnipeg. To the west, Calgary is more like a 20-hour drive. So it really is the biggest city for quite a while. And what that meant growing up for me in terms of culture and in terms of writing community was that it was a great city to grow up in and to come of age in as an artist, because it was so isolated. We had such great access to writers, to other types of culture like symphony. I was big into music, into dance. There's the Royal Winnipeg Ballet there, lots of theater. And because it's not such a big city, it was all very accessible also in terms of festivals and it not being too expensive. So I feel like I really grew up surrounded by a lot of great culture. And I had the opportunity to learn from a young age, really from the time I was a teenager, to work one-on-one with established writers in a mentorship capacity, and that had a big influence on me as a writer. Like Julie said, I went on to do a bachelor's of arts in creative writing and in English at York University, which is in Toronto. And then, my parents were always very supportive of me and my writing. I showed, I think, at an early age that storytelling was really important to me. They always encouraged me. They were always keen to hear what I was working on, to share it with other people. But when I would come to them and say, this is what I wanted to do, they would kind of, a bit of concern as to how I was going to make a living trying to publish novels. So I'm not Margaret Atwood or any other big name writers, but anyway, they certainly encouraged me to make sure I had a good solid plan B, something that I could do that was going to allow me to support myself while I was also writing creatively. And so that's why I ended up at Carleton University in Ottawa to do a journalism degree. And that was all happening in my early 20s. I married my husband, Jason, when I was 24 years old, finished up my master's degree, and then we ended up living overseas in Birmingham, UK, where he was working on his PhD, and I got a job working. That's how I started working in communications. All that time, though, I never stopped writing fiction. Fiction writing for me has always been my outlet, the way that I explore my identity, the way that I explore questions that I have about the world. And living in Birmingham, I got to working with a group of writers out there called the Tyndall Street Fiction Group, and started working on, at the time, what I thought was going to be a collection of short stories. And that turned into my first novel called Holding My Breath. I won't go into too much detail about that novel, but so things took off for me. I had some short fiction published, and then got signed on with an agent, and then, you know, got that book got published, and it was picked up in Canada, it was picked up in the US, it was picked up in the UK, and it actually was also picked up and translated in Germany, but then it never ended up coming out in Germany. This all happened around the time of 2008 and the financial crisis of 2008, so things changed very quickly. I had sort of envisioned my writing life as doing this, you know, this kind of trajectory. Like, I would publish my first book, and then I thought, okay, good, and then I will publish my second book, and then I will publish my third book, and things were going to move up like this for me. And so I learned pretty quickly that that's not the way, well, that's just not the way that life works, and that instead my writing life did things like this. So my first book was fairly successful, I think, for a Canadian writer, and, like, you know, got recognized and so on, and sold pretty well. But after about 6 years from that publication, all the publishers that had published me were no longer in existence. They had all folded. And every time I tell this story, I say it wasn't my fault. I swear to God. Like, you know, there were other things that were happening at the time. But what I found was that there I was, you know, 6 years later, thinking that I was going to be doing this, and all of a sudden I felt like I was out at sea, you know, on a life raft, because all the connections I had, everything, it was all gone. And so I started working on another book. That book will never see the light of day. I started, I then started working on a third book, and all at this time raising a young family. I've got 3 kids. They're now almost 15, 13, and 8. But at the time, my youngest was around 2 years old when I was, you know, trying to work on this third book. And I got about, every day I would sit down and I would write a bit while he was sleeping or while he was in home care. And then, you know, at some point I sat back and I looked at what I had written, and I realized I had like a ridiculous amount of, like, it could have been 300 pages. I don't remember, but all I know is this book was going nowhere. It just was not happening. And I was really, I was really down about all of that, because if I wasn't a writer, if I wasn't writing, if I wasn't publishing, then where, you know, who was I? That was always my identity. And what did this mean for me? So I decided to go back to writing short fiction, which was always and I went back to the beginning of when I started exploring this particular book I was working on. I decided to take these characters and explore them in short fiction and dip in and out of their lives a little bit. And that was how You Are Not What We Expected came to be. The main character in this book, the book is a collection of short stories that are linked. They feature largely the Levine family, and mainly Uncle Isaac, who is an older man who has moved back to the Greater Toronto area at the request of his younger sister to help her out because she's left to look after her 2 grandchildren. And she would like him to come and just be around so that she has some other family around to help. And so we dip in and out of this family and their neighbors throughout this book. And what I found that I was exploring as I was writing this, I now live in Thornhill, the area where this book takes place. And place and setting have always
I'm back.
Yeah.
Lost the sound.
She'll be back.
Throws up. She'll be back.
This is how we do.
She's putting us in suspense, you know?
Okay, that's good.
Sorry. Have that on your Kindle. No problems. You'd be awesome. Good read.
Somewhat confusing a little bit.
Oh, yeah, she just signed off.
You gotta
Maybe
read.
she'll sign back on.
She'll sign back on. Sometimes when it freezes, if you sign off and sign back on, then you get a better connection.
They're a long way away, I'll tell you. Toronto, Seattle.
Of course, with 3 children in the house, it could be that one of the children got on and grabbed the Wi-Fi signal. If you have too many things on your Wi-Fi, then it really slows down and Zoom takes up a lot of space.
We
Julie, do you
want
want
to
to
do
talk?
with one of Julie's books.
That's true, yeah. I think she's going to get one.
This commercial break is brought to you by.
Burn.
So
Julie,
this
what's
is the latest one.
the
I just got a text. Let me see if it's Sidura. Okay, she says she's coming back.
Okay.
And it was her Wi-Fi. It just quit.
It does that, yeah.
Julie, what's this program? Your program in Vermont? What's that like, or how long is it? You know, well, here she is. So.
Okay.
That's true.
Hi, can you?
On a phone now. No, Marvin. Hi.
Sidura, you froze again.
You just say that Zoom does have problems. What you can see is it really quite a. You know how far distance is that?
How's that?
Ah, yay.
Okay. Sorry about that. Something went wonky with the Wi-Fi. I am now going to talk to you on my phone using cellular data. That will probably be more reliable. Okay. I was talking about setting in my books when it looked like everything froze to me. Is that where I left off from your end?
Yes.
Yep.
Yep. Okay. So, right. So setting. So Thornhill, which is the setting of this book, is almost like another character in this book, the setting. And something that I wanted to explore here was the sort of different people's connections to this place, connections to why they've, you know, the choices that they've made to ending up here, and that whole idea of home and what does home mean? What does home mean for different people who look around and realize maybe this wasn't where they were expecting to be all this time, but are here anyway. Yeah, and also that those moments in our lives where we realize, you know, the title being "You Are Not What We Expected." The book went through a number of different titles before I settled on this one. And I settled on this one because I realized with each of these stories, the characters have found themselves in a place where they didn't expect to be. And I don't necessarily mean a physical place, but I mean a place in their lives where they didn't expect to be. So those were some of the things that I was exploring with this book. I said that I had 3 lessons that I learned while I was writing this, and I'll just and I wanted to share those with you. There's some stories that go along with those lessons, and then I can and then I'll read a bit from the book, and we can and then I can take some questions. So hold on. The first lesson that I learned in writing this is the importance of patience when it comes to creating a writing life.
As I said to you at the beginning, you know, I had this vision that my writing career was going to do this, and that's not what happened. But even in all of the ups and downs, with where I've gone with my writing and where I am today, I never lost sight of the importance for me of having fiction as an outlet in my life, and making it a priority as much as I could, and as much as my life has changed from when I wrote my first book to writing this one, making it always a priority in my life to fit fiction in, to fit the writing of fiction in. And the patience comes from not from paying attention or worrying too much about the next publication, because that I have found does not help me at all and doesn't inspire me at all to keep working. But the patience is about knowing that there is always room for having fiction in my life, and what it means to develop a meaningful writing life is so much greater than how often I'm published. There are 13 years between this book and in my last book. I hope there won't be 13 years between this one and my next one, but I've learned so much in between about what it means to have a meaningful writing life and what that looks like for me. So that was number one. Number two, I learned, I was reminded of really, but learned again the power and the importance of community in terms of crafting fiction. So the writing itself is very solitary. It's really, you know, it's me sitting down with my journal or at my computer and diving into these stories that only exist in my head. But the importance of having people around me who both understand what I'm trying to do and also support me in what I'm trying to do. So number one, my husband never ever let me give up on this goal of mine. And often I would come to him while I was working on this book and I felt like it wasn't going anywhere. And I would say, you know, maybe this is the sign, maybe this is where I should be looking at making a change in my work life. And he just kept saying to me, no, just go sit down and write your book. Just finish the book, he would say. And I found that I was feeling very lonely as a writer. And funnily enough, you know, here I was living in Toronto, or in the Toronto area, where there's a lot going on in terms of writing. But it's such a big city that, unlike Winnipeg, I have found that it doesn't always feel accessible to me. And so finding writing communities through the Sarah Selecki Writing School, which I first started out in as a student and, you know, now teach in, and then also going to Vermont College and finding my writing community there, that's made a huge difference to me in terms of how I approach my work, in terms of my own enthusiasm for my work. And I've realized that even though the writing itself is very solitary, the importance of having other people around me who can understand that process is so important. And then the last lesson that I wanted to share with you is a lesson that I hope I can translate for my kids beyond just the writing experience. And it's the importance of rejection, and how rejection opened doors for me with this book. So I'm going to tell you a bit of a little story about this. I was away on a writing retreat with some other teachers, writing teachers, and we were talking about submitting work and how the differences between how men submit writing work and how women submit writing work. And one of the other writers, she sits on a advisory board for a literary journal, and she said that often what would happen if a woman was submitting a piece for consideration and got rejected, they wouldn't hear from her again. But when a man would submit a piece and would get rejection, he would turn around and just submit another piece. And, you know, and we were all saying how we need to have that kind of confidence in our own work. And then another friend of mine in part of the group, she mentioned that she had a friend who there's a platform called SubmitAbul, which is an online platform, and you can easily submit work to different journals that way. And she said he had over 300 rejections in his SubmitAbul folder. And that meant that he had been submitting work, you know, so much that means that he had submitted many, many more pieces if he had, you know, 300 rejections. But I had a real epiphany when she said that I realized, wait a minute, I could get 300 rejections. I realized I had no guarantee that I could ever get published again. But I knew that with enough hard work, I could get 300 rejections. And it totally shifted the way I thought about submitting my work. And so this friend and I decided we built a bit of an accountability relationship. So we would email each other once a week. And I made a goal that every week I had this collection of short stories that I had, you know, worked on and developed, and I could send, you know, and I was keen to start sending them out. So every week I would take 5 pieces and I would send them to different journals, and I used SubmitAbul to see what the different requirements were, and as long as I felt I had a piece that fit a requirement for a journal, I sent it out. By the end of the year, oh, and the other thing that I learned as a side note was that I could submit pieces to more than one journal at the same time. I didn't know that until this. By the end of the year, I had 120 different submissions. I had 9 of my stories picked up by different publications for publication, and I had countless rejections. I lost count. But I realized that what I'd done is I had taken the emotion out of rejection, and what I had allowed myself to do was to become a part of the conversation. Publishing and the literary world, it's all about being a part of the conversation, and rejection is just a part of that. And when you know, and so when I'm speaking to newer writers who are getting ready to send their work out, I really want them to understand that what we send out and how people react to it, it's not personal, but you have to get yourself into that conversation in order for other parts of the conversation to happen. And so that was the third lesson for me. That was really, really important, and probably what gave me the confidence then, by the end of the year and before I started at Vermont College, to take the collection and send it off to my original editor from my first book, who was now the assistant publisher at a publisher called House of Anansi Press. And I sent her an email and I said, this is what I'm working on. You know, it's been a long time since we've been in touch, but would you be interested in this? She said, by all means, send it along. And to cut a long story short, one of her editors decided to pick it up. So after all of that, in terms of it getting published as a book, I sent it to just one publisher, and it got picked up. And so, yeah, so that was those are my 3 lessons from this book. Because I'm talking to you all, there we go. Okay, now I can see you a bit better. I would like to read a little bit from this now, and then we can open it up to questions. And maybe, Justin, will you be able to monitor the questions? Because I'm on my phone, I can't see everybody.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. So I'm going to read to you from the first story in this book. It's called The Flag, and it features the cat character I was talking about earlier, Uncle Isaac. The Flag. Isaac would like people to understand that the world has rules and that these rules should not be ignored. You should not kill another human being. You should not steal. You should make an effort to look after your community and help it to flourish. And you should never, not under any circumstances, fly one country's flag underneath another's. It's degrading, he's yelling at the man with the black velvet skull cap. It's disrespectful. I can't even stand to look at what you've done. You want to honor Israel, but you've done just the opposite. The man, the principal of the very school Isaac has barged into, is nodding his head politely, albeit with his arms crossed in front of his chest, his back very straight, feet shoulder-width apart. As Isaac berates him, the principal wonders if now is the right time to organize proper security at the school. Don't ask how Isaac, elderly, short, inconspicuous, managed to just walk right into this building. Other schools in this predominantly Jewish neighborhood just north of Toronto have elaborate security checks, offices positioned right by the front door, secretaries with panic buttons, security guards out front. But Isaac was just out on his morning walk. He was just taking the route he always takes, past the brownstone townhouses, past the strip mall filled with kosher shops, a bakery, a pizza parlor, past the Lubavitch Community Center, and then past the houses on the boulevard, which were starting to look tired from all the children who live in them. Tired the way a favorite t-shirt gets frayed and faded on someone who, over the years, has put on 10 pounds. He walks past all the bicycles and scooters, the double strollers parked on the narrow front lawns, and then past this school, of which he never took notice until today. On the flagpole, there are 2 flags instead of 1, and the Israeli flag is flying below the Canadian. The principal takes a breath when Isaac appears to have paused. Every year, the week of Israel's birthday, we fly the Israeli flag in its honor, he says. Many of our graduates go on to make Aliyah. We proudly support Eretz Israel. So invest in another flagpole, Isaac yells. We'll take your suggestion under consideration. The principal places his hand on Isaac's shoulder, leading him to the front door. No, you won't. You're going to ignore me. You know, there are 193 flagpoles at the United Nations. This is about international law. One of the teachers, a young woman in a knit beret and an ankle-length denim skirt, has stopped to watch the commotion. Rabbi, she says, her voice quiet but shaking, should I call security? The principal shakes his head. They both know there is no security. They would have to call the police, and Isaac, while certainly irate, is hardly threatening. The gentleman was just leaving. I'm still waiting for an answer, Isaac bellows. Before today, he never knew the strength of his own voice, understood the power of his words. He feels like an opera singer, a baritone reaching his climax, his mouth wide open, his hand outstretched and then clenched as he comes to his resounding conclusion. And yet he doesn't want to finish. He could argue like this all day. You're a caring man, the principal says, opening the door, pushing Isaac firmly but gently through the doorway to the spring air, cool against his hot face. Really, I appreciate you bringing this to our attention. And then before Isaac can say any more, the door is shut. The principal locks it, making a note to send a memo to all staff that the front door must be locked at all times until further notice. Isaac stands facing the door for a long time, long enough to watch the principal walk back down the hall and up the stairs to his office, where Isaac knows he will ignore everything that happened during the last 15 minutes. Isaac is standing in the shadow of the 2 flags. He steps away from it to be in the sun. He looks up and wonders if he couldn't just take the flag down himself, but he's in clear view of some men from the synagogue next door taking a cigarette break, and there are all the children in the classrooms. Isaac walks away panting, his heart beating so wildly, the blood pounds against his ears, and he feels as if his whole face is pulsating. Thank you. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn it over now to all of you, because I would love to hear your questions and have a bit of a dialogue that way.
Marilyn, good.
I just wondered if any of the characters were based on your own family or people that you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Uncle Isaac is based on and inspired by my husband's uncle, Uncle Harry, who moved back, not moved back, Harry, they're originally from Montreal, but who moved to this area about 10 years ago for completely different reasons than why Isaac has moved. But he is he doesn't compromise, Uncle Harry. And in fact, the first story is based on something that actually happened, where he did barge into a school and was upset because one flag was flying beneath the other. And when Harry came into our lives, back into my husband's life, but really into mine because I didn't really know him before, I would listen to his stories, and I just thought that he was a character in and of himself, and I couldn't help it. It was just bubbling to come out. He was that inspiring. I would say he's the one that's most obvious to me in terms of the inspiration for other characters in this book, or for that particular character in the book. I'm trying to think if any of the other characters are based that much on other people. They're not specifically, but you know, I'm always, as a writer, I'm always watching. I'm always keeping my eyes open. I'm always listening. I'm always, you know, so each story, if I, you know, if I went through each story, I could probably say to you, well, this was based on, you know, or I was inspired by something I heard somebody say over here, or I was inspired by something I read in the paper. That's often how it starts for me. I'll see something or read something and start asking questions, and then go from there in terms of how I explore stories.
Judy?
I have a question.
I think Judy Finkel has a question.
Yeah. Hi. No, mentioning having a city or a neighborhood as a place. I just was going to tell you, first of all, that my daughter-in-law, Joanne Schwartz, grew up with your family in Winnipeg, and she said she's still friends with Avatar, and it made me wonder whether you have thought of writing a book where the setting would be Winnipeg, where you grew up.
So my first book takes place in Winnipeg, but it takes place in Winnipeg before I was born. That book was looking at Winnipeg in the 1950s and 60s. And what I was, first of all, going back to Joanne Schwartz, Joanne's brother is Adam, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I worked as a teacher's assistant in Adam's class when he was in grade 7, and my brother-in-law and my sister are friends with Adam. So I know that, I know the family, and I remember Joanne from my sister Avital's class. So my first book, like I said, takes place in Winnipeg in the 1950s and 60s, and I was interested in exploring Jewish Winnipeg at that time because it was post-World War II, where the community shifted from being an immigrant community to a more established community, and there was a movement from the north end of the city to the south end of the city. I'm not familiar enough with Houston or other cities to be able to make this kind of comparison, but I think you can understand, you know, where you have an area of the city where the community would have first settled in as immigrants, and then as they become more established and wealthier, they move to the southern part of the city, which was newer and you know, and more prosperous. And there was a real tug of war in terms of the community for a long time, whether you were a North End Jew or a South End Jew. My mother grew up in the South End, my father in the North End, and my parents, and that was, you know, that was always a big joke in our family about that. So that second book that I worked on after my first book that I've said will probably never see the light of day, that one takes place in Winnipeg in the 1980s. I don't know that I would go back to that book specifically, but I imagine I will end up back there, or I will end up exploring there at some point, because it's just, you know, I think I said in the beginning that for me, writing is very much about exploring identity, and I'm constantly doing that, exploring my own identity through my work. So I imagine I will end up back in my writing in Winnipeg, probably in the 80s and 90s at some point.
Sharon had a question.
Yeah. Did you consider self-publishing, because it's extremely popular here for people that are writing books like historical fiction that takes place right in our region, and there may not be a national interest in it?
I thought about it a lot. I even went to I've been to sessions that talk about, you know, the differences between self-publishing and traditional publishing. There were a few things I felt that I would need to consider or feel confident in if I was going to go the self-publishing route. Number one, I think that self-publishing works well, as you said, for certain types of books. So historical fiction, perhaps romance, maybe mysteries. So genre books, at least in Canada, that's what I've heard. It can work well for that. And you have to be very, very confident and out there in terms of your marketing. You have to be out there in terms of marketing anyway, but I really value the relationship building that happens in traditional publishing with an editor. I value the having the Anansi name behind my title has opened up a lot of doors for me in terms of the kind of publicity that I've gotten. But at the same time, I've had to put a lot of my own effort and become a lot more comfortable with social media than I ever was before, because I don't love it. But yeah, so it's, you know, I didn't think that for what I was doing, that I would be able to get the reach that I need in terms of building my own career through self-publishing. But that doesn't mean that I wouldn't consider it for a different project. The last thing I would say though about self-publishing, and unfortunately it's just based on my own experience and what I've seen, is that often there are so many steps to publishing in terms of the editing process, and unfortunately those get missed, and that's unfortunate. And if you do decide to self-publish and then hire an editor to work with you, it's a very expensive process. So by getting on with a publisher, I was getting all of those. I was getting all of that element of publishing without having to pay for it myself.
One more question. So you said that, like Winnipeg was 20 hours from Calgary and all that. How far from Ottawa is it? I mean, don't you have anything nearby?
No, Ottawa is even further from Winnipeg than Toronto, because Ottawa is about 4 hours east of Toronto. So don't you have anything nearby Winnipeg? There are smaller towns and cities near Winnipeg. I was noting that, like, if you wanted to get to a city bigger than Winnipeg, that's how far you had to go to. But yeah, you would pass through, there's the whole province of Saskatchewan, so Regina, Saskatoon, those are cities. Yeah. In the province, and then I said, if you were going south, there's Grand Forks, there's Fargo. But like, when I say that, like, that's what we did as kids when we would travel, when I was growing up. We would get in the car and drive down to Grand Forks. That was a big deal. It was not easy to get to places. Now you could fly, and certainly now not right now, but in general, when I'm going home to visit my family, I usually fly. My family, my husband and my kids, we do like train travel. And there is a beautiful train that runs from Toronto to Winnipeg. So my kids have done that a lot. And that's a whole other story in and of itself. I mean, that is just a gorgeous ride. So we've really grown to love that. We're hoping this summer, as things start to open up, we're hoping that we'll be able to drive from here to Winnipeg, and really to be in Gimli, Manitoba, which is where my family has a cottage, on Lake Winnipeg. That's what we're hoping to be able to do this summer, and we're just waiting to hear what the different provinces are saying in terms of whether, at this point, if we were to go to Winnipeg, we would be expected to self-isolate for 14 days. So it doesn't make any sense for us to go and self-isolate and not be able to see my parents or my sister who live out there. That's a bit of a roundabout way of getting at your answer. So yeah, so there are places, but Winnipeg is certainly the biggest city in a long distance, as opposed to, I live here in Toronto, and like, Montreal, Ottawa, if we were going to go south, 10 hours south to Washington, New York, Boston, any of those places are an easy drive.
Question about, I guess, more the book industry as a whole, and like book sales. I mean, obviously right now it's a online world as we're doing this obviously on Zoom, but what do you know of as far as, like, percentages or, books that are being sold at Barnes & Noble? I guess your books, like even this book, are most of them being sold online? Is that Barnes & Noble? Is it an independent bookseller? And just the trend in the industry as far as, Amazon versus bookstores?
So I can't really speak to numbers because I'm not in the publishing industry. Like, other people would be better at speaking to numbers, and it's probably different in the States than it is here. I can tell you that my husband read an article the other day that said that 1 of every $2 spent online is spent at Amazon. That's not just in books, that's just in general. So that's, gives you an idea of the, how ginormous this empire is. I'm would guess that especially right now, a lot of book sales are taking place online. In Canada, we have Amazon, we have Amazon.ca. We also have a big bookstore across Canada, chain of bookstores across Canada called Indigo or Chapters. They're the same, they're owned by the same. And so you can order books online from them. And we've shifted in our house now to ordering most of our books from Indigo or Chapters if we can. And then there are all of the independent bookstores. My favorite independent bookstore is in Winnipeg. It's called McNally Robinson's. I started, my first job was at McNally's. I worked there for 5 years as a teenager and a young adult. You know, so there's a big push to encourage people to buy books, if they're buying books online, to buy independent bookstores. Unfortunately for us, where we live, we don't have any independent bookstores close by. The closest bookstore for us is an Indigo branch that's about a 10-minute drive from here. So I don't really feel I have the option to buy from an independent, you know, to be able to pick up from an independent. If I lived in Winnipeg, I'd be buying all my books from McNally's. But I'll share with you, I guess, you know, in terms of just in terms of the business of all of this, and I'm still somewhat uncomfortable, but I'm happy to have the conversation. My husband and I decided to put some of our own money towards promoting this book because it's an indie publisher that I'm with, and there's sort of only so much that they can put towards promoting the book. And so one of the ways that we are ourselves supporting the marketing of this book is I use the social media companies, two young women who run this social media, local women who run a social media company. And one of the things that they do for me is they will put together an online ad. And so we were going back and forth about whether that ad should link to Amazon, or whether it should link to my publisher's website. And we decided to keep it at Amazon, especially in the States, because online, it's, you know, that idea of you don't want the person you're trying to sell something to have to click too many times in order to purchase the book, and also knowing that so many people are purchasing their books through Amazon these days. So I go back and forth, where on the one hand, I will encourage everybody to purchase from a local indie bookstore if you have one close by, if you have one that you like to frequent. But at the same time, I know that I've also got ads that are leading people towards Amazon. And so it's uncomfortable. It's tricky. It's tricky in the industry right now. And Amazon certainly has the monopoly. And unfortunately for a lot of smaller shops, it's hard to compete with what they can do in terms of how quickly they can get things out, and and how accessible what they have is available, especially in the States. You know, I understand you can do grocery shopping from Amazon in some cities and get your groceries, you know, within 3 hours or something like that. We don't have that here. It doesn't come quite that quickly for us. But yeah, but it's hard. It's definitely hard for smaller shops to compete with that.
And you may see the chat note here from Julie Herman that Brazos Bookstore on Bissonnette, they're able to order Sidura's book. So if you're interested in getting it, that could in supporting an indie bookstore, that could be a way to do that here in Houston.
Fantastic, and please do.
I have a couple more questions. So, you know, your book is not on Kindle, apparently.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. I got it on.
Oh, okay, good, because I didn't see it there. Okay. And yeah, that's all.
Okay, so sometimes when you go onto Amazon, if you find yourself on the paperback, you know, page, there's like another button you can click on, and that'll get you to the Kindle.
It's not showing.
Excellent.
What is your other book on Kindle also?
No, my other book is not on Kindle. My other book came out before Kindle was actually a thing, and It did not get onto Kindle. It is on Kobo.
I don't know. So you have no way to go and get the rights to the book again and put it?
No, I do have the rights to the book again. I do have the rights to the book. I actually, once my Canadian publisher folded, I bought back all of the copies of my first books. So they are sitting in my husband's warehouse. And if anybody's interested in purchasing a hard copy of my first book, if you go onto my website, siduraludwig.com, there's a button that will take you to where you can purchase a copy of that book, and we can ship it out from here. We're still working on, we're behind in terms of getting that onto Amazon. But so it's available in hard copy, but it's not available. That first book isn't available on Kindle. Not yet, anyway.
I don't know if I can be heard. Sidura, I
Yeah,
was
I hear.
born in Toronto, grew up in Toronto, and lived in Thornhill for about 7-8 years before we moved down to Houston. And when we moved up, it was really a small town. People in Toronto said, "Where are you moving to?"
Yeah.
But everybody came and joined that community, and I'm looking forward to reading your book to see how it's developed. And
Thank
I've
you.
certainly enjoyed your talk today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I can't tell what your name is from your handle.
It's Bela Abrams.
Oh, hi, Bela.
Bela Abrams. And I
Okay.
even have my sister Sharon from Toronto
I'm higher up on the screen.
on there today.
Oh, I saw. Okay.
I'm from
I
Toronto.
told her she might enjoy it. Okay.
Yeah, and I have very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you both for joining. Yeah. So just a quick background to Thornhill, like Bela says, it was a suburb that was developed in the 80s. My in-laws, for example, bought their house, the house they still live in. They're the original owners, and the area that they live in was developed in the early 80s. So my husband grew up in that house, and the community, the Jewish community in Toronto, I mean, it goes way back, and has moved progressively north, as we say, along Bathurst Street. You can chart the community moving north along Bathurst Street. Thornhill is still a very Jewish area. North of us, there's another area now called Thornhill Woods that's become quite popular for younger families to move into, and then even further north, it just keeps moving further north. The house that we live in was built around 87, and then other homes in our neighborhood were there was a slowdown. I think around 87 there was a real estate crash, and then after a few years things started to build up, maybe 10 years later. So that's the area that we live in, and we chose to come up here because we wanted to be accessible. We wanted, we were looking at schools and synagogues and making sure we were walking distance from the synagogue that we eventually chose, and it just so happened that congregation was housed in the school that we chose for our kids. So being walking distance from Jewish day school and having all of the different amenities that are up here for living a really vibrant Jewish life made it an attractive place for us to come to. Also, my husband grew up in this neighborhood. It's not where I thought I was going to end up, and I joke about that sometimes with the title, "You Are Not What We Expected." I didn't think that I was going to end up in Thornhill. I envisioned myself more as an urban girl, something like the Annex. Bailey, you'll probably remember, the Annex or something like that. But for all kinds of reasons, this is what made sense, and I'm not sorry, especially now, I have to say. With the pandemic and being able to comfortably walk around, there's no crowding up here, and knowing my kids can go outside to play, my youngest can go and ride his bike safely, all those kinds of things. So but there's a lot more. That's the other thing, is that I hope people take this away from my book, but there's a lot more to this neighborhood than it's not homogeneous, and a lot of people outside of here really think of it that way. And what I've discovered living here is that there are so many different types of stories and experiences that are Jewish experiences, and so many different kinds of Jewish people and non-Jewish people too. But for the purposes of this book and the community I was looking at, there's no one Jewish experience, and that's something that I feel really strongly about, and that I want for people to understand, is that there's lots of different ways of experiencing and living Jewish life, and that's all happening up here.
Well, I'm Bela's sister, Sharon, as well, Sharon Roebuck from Toronto, and I grew up, and we were born in the Annex, and I lived Midtown, sort of in Bathurst, that ongoing strip, and I was excited to hear that a Canadian author was going to be on Zoom today, and I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
I may call on you to see if you can also review one of your books for my council group.
With pleasure.
Yeah, I would love it. And it was really, really nice to be part of this. Thank you, Justin, for allowing me to join. And thank you, my sister Bela, for suggesting it. I enjoyed it very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Sharon, for saying so. And anybody, I'm booking book talks into the summer and into the fall, and I'm happy to do this for any other groups. So please, you can get my email from Justin and email me directly, and I'd be more than happy to book something.
Also, Ludwig is the name of a well-known obstetrician in Toronto. Is your husband relation?
No. First of all, Ludwig is my last name.
Oh,
my birth name. Yeah. And I get that a lot here, because that Dr. Ludwig, I think, delivered the entire Jewish community of a certain generation. But I am related to many Dr. Ludwigs, but he is not one of them.
Oh, okay. Very good.
Yeah.
Oh, Marilyn?
I just wondered if any of your kids are interested in writing. Have they shown any interest?
Thanks for asking that. My kids they are all very good writers. My oldest son is an excellent communicator, and he writes beautiful essays. Like, now I'm telling, right? You've asked about my kids, so sorry, I'm a Jewish mother. You are not going to get, you're gonna get the top of the top in terms of how I talk about them. But yeah, so he doesn't write so much fiction, but he loves politics and essay writing and persuasive writing. My daughter has my little writer heart was beating so well, because she's decided she's writing fan fiction about her favorite TV show Glee, and just to watch her sitting in her bed with her journal, I don't care what they're writing, but just to see that that's something that she's enjoying, that was more than enough for me. And then my youngest, who's 8, so they've got all these Zoom classes for school right now, and I don't even get me started on school, but he had 2 assignments for school that had to do with creative writing, and I watched him just dive into these stories. One was a Star Wars story. He just couldn't get enough of it, of writing it. And then the second one they did on fractured fairy tales, and he wrote one called Jack and the Dandelion. And I could see, what I loved about it was watching how much he loved doing it. And then he read it out to me, and he was so proud of himself. And I said to him, you're a real writer, because I could see how much pride he was taking in it. So I just hope that they will all see writing as an outlet. I don't care how they use it. For me, I just don't want it to be, I don't want them ever to say, oh, that's not for me, or that, that I don't write, because they can, and they do. Somebody in the chat was asking about my favorite writers, my favorite authors. I have so many.
Hey, Barbara.
Hi, Barbara. Thank you. Oh my gosh. Well, Laurie Lanson's is one of my favorites. She's a Canadian now writer living in the States. She wrote a book a while back called The Girls, which was absolutely one of my favorite books. And then Elizabeth Strout, Olive Kitteridge. Olive Kitteridge had that had a big influence on this book. I was envisioning that book a lot while I was writing this book. I've shifted because of my schoolwork into reading a lot of young adult and children's writers, and so I've become big fans of different YA and children's writers. I'm enjoying, so Kekla Magoon is a brilliant children and YA writer, and I just finished a book called Sweep. And Sweep, I have forgotten. The author is Jonathan Oggs. His last name starts with an AUX. That was a brilliant book. I see, that's my problem, is that I read all these books and then they become my favorite for that point in time. I'm going to show you one. It's a young adult. This one I could not put down, The Degenerates by J. Albert Mann. Julie, she's a VCFA. It is outstanding, and it doesn't matter if you usually read YA or not. This is a historical fiction, takes place in Boston in the 1920s, and it has to do with the institution. There was what they would call the institution for, what did they call it? Oh, the Massachusetts School for the Feeble-Minded. And it was this school that was actually open until 2014. But in the 1920s, I know you would not believe, but all these different people who were considered basically not normal would end up at this school. And so she writes about this book from the perspective of 4 different characters, and I couldn't put it down. My kids were trying to get my attention, and I kept running from room to room just to keep reading it. So that's another one that I'm loving right now. So I think I'll stop there though, because that's a lot of, and then in terms of other writers that in general have had a big influence on my life, Carol Shields. Carol Shields was a Winnipeg-based writer. She passed away far too soon. And her work, I always admired her work as being, as making the ordinary extraordinary. And that's something that I aim for in my own work. Julie, do you mind repeating your question you just typed? Because it pops up quickly on my phone and then I can't see it again.
So I asked if you're going to be doing your Holla Bake on Facebook Live this coming Thursday.
Not this coming Thursday. I did one this past Thursday. I mentioned just briefly how I've had to really adjust, with the pandemic in terms of how I reach readers. And so one of the early on in all of this, before my book was even published, but as I was coming up to publication date, I came up with this idea of hosting a weekly Thursday night challah bake, which I call Kneading and Reading. And so I make challah every week anyway, and so anyone who tunes in on a Thursday night can watch watch the challah that I make, and I show how to do a 6-strand braid and some other braids that are fun. And then I use it also as an opportunity to read a 5-minute section from the book. And people can type in questions and ask me things, and I talk about baking and I talk about writing. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been a really fun way to reach people. I've discovered over the last few weeks, as the weather's gotten better, we noticed that the numbers were going down in terms of viewers. And so we decided that I probably didn't need to do it every week, but this past week I did one and I had a great turnout, and I did both challah and cinnamon buns. So anyone who's interested, you can go onto Facebook onto my author page. So it's Sidura Ludwig author, and you can see the video because the videos stay on the feed. So if you're interested in seeing how to turn challah dough into cinnamon buns, I show that. And everyone in my house said they turned out really well.
That was delicious.
Any other questions for Sidura? All right. Well, I wanted to Sidura, thanks for where'd you go? I really appreciate.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I really appreciate. I think we all appreciate you coming out today, and I encourage everyone that maybe hasn't had a chance to read the book but is considering it. Definitely. As Julie said, they can order it. Brazos Bookstore can order it, so we can kind of support a Jewish author and stuff like that. As your book was published just over a month ago. It's not that long. So.
Yeah, not that long, and it's definitely available in the U.S. And so, and just thank you so much. I really appreciate all your interest and all your questions. It's been wonderful meeting you all. And I'm sorry about the snafu early on, but I'm glad we could find a way to reconnect.